Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, desolators, peasants, vassals. I'm a useful idiot, and today I'm going to follow up my video on the Muslim Brotherhood as Western Puppets with a video about Al-Qaeda as Western Puppets. And this is all the more relevant today, just as that previous question was, because we see Al-Qaeda activities all over the Middle East and North Africa. So, and the case about Al-Qaeda being a Western puppets is a much easier case to make because the connections between the United States and the CIA are well established and well documented and acknowledged from everyone from Brzezinski to Hillary Clinton to Barack Obama. So it's a much easier case to make, and I think most people are familiar with this history by now. The militant Islamists that we know today were a combination of the CIA, the United States, and Saudi Arabia working with the Muslim Brotherhood and supplying Islamic fighters to fight the Soviet occupation of invasion of Afghanistan back in the 80s. And this is when this group was first exploited and armed and organized. And it's historically noted already that so-called Al-Qaeda sprang from this organization, and in fact Osama bin Laden participated in this Afghanistan campaign in the 80s, and then formed his own group to carry this Islamist militancy to more extremes, and of course after American targets. And they were interested in American targets when Saudi Arabia violated their soil by allowing American troops there. That's something that's also well established knowledge about bin Laden's motives. But so let's get to the history of so-called Al-Qaeda first. So, like I say, the Mujahdeen was created and fought in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 80s, and then a lot of these groups went back home afterwards and used these same ideas and philosophies to foment violence back in their own home countries. And bin Laden was no exception. He ended up forming the so-called bin Laden group in August 11, 1988. And he found himself going from one country to the next, including Sudan, and then returning to Saudi Arabia, then eventually ended up in Afghanistan. And it's in Afghanistan and Pakistan that he ended up setting up his notorious training camps that supposedly led to 9/11. Although, interestingly, officially, he never claimed a responsibility for 9/11. And in fact, the U.S. Never charged him with the 9/11 act. So that's an interesting fact in itself. And one of the other aspects of this whole Osama bin Laden Al-Qaeda saga, too, that perpetrate the idea that the Al-Qaeda are Western puppets is all the so-called Osama bin Laden videos and tapes, many of which are known to be fabricated. And that would seem to be indicating that the United States is using Al-Qaeda or the mythology of Al-Qaeda and wanting to perpetrate this mythology by creating those fake tapes. And you know, whether you agree with the fake tapes idea or not is actually superfluous because it's not part of the necessarily part of the big picture that I'm driving at here. So let's get back to some of this history. Let's talk about the name for a minute. So, well, one of the things that's notable about Al-Qaeda is this name was fabricated by the West, by the CIA, and it was not an internally used name. And once again, that points to the fact that the West and other interested parties like Israel and Saudi Arabia have created this umbrella name, Al-Qaeda, in order to label this new boogeyman. And so Al-Qaeda is creating a mythology, and then the reality followed. And I find that pretty fascinating in itself, because the Muslim Brotherhood was a reality, and the mythology of the Muslim Brotherhood was created based on a reality. And what I mean by that is the organization actually did exist. They called themselves the Muslim Brotherhood. They were a peaceful organization, and the mythology was created based on this peaceful organization that had Islamist extremist wings, and terrorist cells in it. And so the reality was there, and the mythology was created based on that. But in Al-Qaeda's case, it's interesting because technically Al-Qaeda didn't exist. The mythology was created first, and the realities come after that. The reality is based on the mythology. And what I mean by that is we have all these groups across the globe that have nothing to do with Osama bin Laden. A lot of them don't even have anything to do with Islamist extremism, although most of them do. And yet now they're all affiliating themselves with Al-Qaeda across the globe, and creating a new reality of an Al-Qaeda that didn't exist before, that does now. A good example of that is in 2002, it was estimated that bin Laden's group numbered 170. Hardly a formidable force. But by 2006, with the legend of 9/11 under their belt, all of a sudden there were several thousand Al-Qaeda affiliated groups across the globe in 40 countries. So they all want to be involved in the Al-Qaeda, the notoriety of Al-Qaeda now, and the credibility it gives your group if you affiliate with this group. So this name, interestingly, Dr. Saud al-Faqih, a Saudi, said in a PBS interview, quote, "Well, I laugh when I hear the FBI talking about Al-Qaeda as an organization of bin Laden. It's really a very simple story. They used to go to the battlefield and come back without documentation. There was no documentation of who had arrived, who has left, how long he stayed. That record, that documentation, was called the record of Al-Qaeda, or the base." So that was Al-Qaeda. There was nothing sinister about it. It's not like an organization. I don't think bin Laden used any name for this group, unquote. So there's the reality of the situation. And that's what I mean. It didn't really exist until the West created this mythology. And in fact, Mark Sageman, former CIA officer, said, quote, "Al-Qaeda is now just a loose label for a movement that seems to target the West. There is no umbrella organization. We like to create a mythical entity called Al-Qaeda in our minds, but that is not the reality we are dealing with," unquote. So that spells it out even plainer than I did. And in fact, Osama bin Laden himself said in October 2001, quote, "So the situation isn't like the West portrays it, that there is an organization with a specific name. It was born without any intention from us. The name was established by mere chance. We established the training camps for our Mujahdeen against Russia's terrorism. We used to call the training camp Al-Qaeda. The name stayed," unquote. So there we have it. The name fabricated by the West, once again showing that it is a tool to be used, and that Al-Qaeda, just by the very nature that the United States has created the mythology, are puppets. And another thing that, like I was talking about earlier, we have the spread across the globe. So we have direct affiliates, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, we have Al-Shabaab in Somalia, we have the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, we have Al-Qaeda Saudi Arabia, we have the Islamic Jihad of Yemen, and the Al-Nusra Front. And those are all the only direct affiliates, and those are all pretty much in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is where we're seeing a lot of Al-Qaeda activity, and these are a lot of local struggles. And that's another thing to understand, that for a lot of these groups, their struggles are local. A lot of these groups that affiliate themselves with Al-Qaeda across the globe, including in Southeast Asia and Africa, they're involved in local struggles. It's not about necessarily global jihad. Global jihad is something that is particularly attributed to the so-called bin Laden group, or the main Al-Qaeda group. So that's an interesting thing about this whole worldwide global terror network that the United States tries to paint Al-Qaeda. It's local struggles. One of the reasons why I say that the United States likes to paint Al-Qaeda as this vast, sinister organization that's well-funded, well-organized, and is all coordinating their activities, that's not the truth. One of the reasons why I know they're trying to portray it that way, because who could forget those Rumsfeld during the Iraq or the Afghanistan invasion in Tora Bora, when Rumsfeld presented these diagrams of these super multi-level cement bunkers that would have taken 20 years to build, with multiple levels and sleeping quarters for hundreds, if not thousands, of fighters and well stocked with food and everything else. And Rumsfeld indicated that they had several of these, which is completely preposterous. I mean, Al-Qaeda and bin Laden existed in caves in Afghanistan, actual caves, not super secret multi-level bunkers. You know, how preposterous that was. And another reason we can say Al-Qaeda is used as puppets, of course, is what we're seeing in Syria, because they're being used as puppets by the United States. They're being used as puppets by Saudi Arabia. And just like I pointed out with Muslim Brotherhood, the Al-Qaeda, they don't necessarily have to know where their arms and money are coming from, or certainly all the foot soldiers on the ground don't necessarily have to know where it comes through. It's kind of like with the Mujahdeen in Afghanistan. A lot of the money is funneled through Pakistan intelligence. And the funding for Mujahdeen, incidentally, in Afghanistan was $600 million a year from the CIA and $600 million a year from Saudi Arabia. So a lot of money was going to arm these Islamist fighters who eventually became Al-Qaeda. And one of the mythologies that's created about Al-Qaeda as well is that they had a huge impact on the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets, and in actuality they didn't. There was 250,000 local Afghan Mujahdeen, many of which who turned into the Taliban, but there was only 2,000 foreign Mujahdeen in Afghanistan at any given time, although 35,000 cycled through Afghanistan and returned to their homelands to increase the potency of local insurgencies. And one of the other interesting aspects, and this ties into Saudi funding of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda as Western puppets, as we see, as I point out, Saudi Arabia in Syria. And one of the reasons is Al-Qaeda is predominantly Sunni, so they are a tool in this Sunni versus Shia violence that we see all across the Middle East, specifically in Syria. Now we see it in Iraq as well. We have a Sunni insurgency inside of Iraq who is now affiliating itself with Al-Qaeda from insurgents coming in from Syria, all armed by Saudi Arabia. And we're also seeing the same dynamics play out in Lebanon. So we're seeing the Al-Qaeda, or so-called Al-Qaeda, being used as puppets, certainly by Saudi Arabia and vicariously by the United States and Israel for that reason. And another reason to look a little deeper into this is look at how Al-Qaeda was used in Libya as well. The United States and NATO used Al-Qaeda to a great extent, these Islamist militants, and now that country is deep in the hands of those same so-called Al-Qaeda militants and militias. And so they were useful idiots. They were puppets in U.S.-NATO action against Libya, and now they are left behind. And we find them spilling over to places like Mali. And of course, this is where it becomes problematic, because needless to say, a group like Al-Qaeda or Muslim Brotherhood can be puppets of the West and still not always be able to be controlled. That kind of energy can't always be completely harnessed the way you want to, and that's why it's very dangerous for actors like the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel to use these Islamic militancies for their goals, whether it's Libya or Syria or other places. And but part of this strategy that they're using is spelled out well in this. This is a quote from an intelligence officer. He says, "From organized chaos, you can reorder the system according to your dictates. There are those in Western intelligence, the idea of which began in London circles, that knew that by installing Islamic fundamentalists you can control Muslim-majority societies far more decisively, and that the sum total of all these Islamist regimes pose no real military threat to Israel, given the combined might of Israel, U.S., and NATO." Very, very interesting statement. So it lays down the fact that Al-Qaeda and many of these militant Islamists certainly pose no real threat to the combined military might of the Israel, United States, and NATO. So to say their national security threat is overstated. But But more importantly, the idea that by installing Islamic fundamentalists, you can control Muslim-majority societies. So that's one of the reasons why they use Al-Qaeda, why they use Islamist extremists, why they use Muslim Brotherhood, because that's how they reach the actual people, and much easier control. For example, with the United States in Egypt, it's much more malleable for them to have the Muslim Brotherhood in charge of Egypt than it is for them to have the military there. And in fact, they're finding that out because now the Egypt is government is building, military government is building a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia at the expense of the United States. And another reason why we probably know that the Al-Qaeda and Islamist militants, per se, are Western puppets is because the United States had 2 chances to get bin Laden, and they turned it down because they needed the bin Laden Al-Qaeda mythology to continue to perpetrate the war on terror. So they didn't really want to get him back. And those 2 examples were Tim Carney, former ambassador of Sudan, suggested that Sudan offered to hand bin Laden over to the Clinton administration, but was rebuffed. And then we saw that same thing again previous to the invasion of Afghanistan when the Taliban offered to hand over bin Laden and Bush refused. And in fact, of course, we see this bin Laden mythology perpetrated because Al-Qaeda are Western puppets, and he needed to be kept alive for another 10 years. And so there's a lot of debate. I'm one of the ones who believes that bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, actually died about 10 years ago, and that this entire killing recently was a fake. And I certainly have respect for those who believe that that's not the case and that things are actually the way they are. If you choose to believe that, that's fine. I just kind of feel like with his health problems, he was probably dead 10 years ago, and there's a lot of reports to that effect, which is, so my view, certainly holds up the idea that bin Laden was necessary as a figurehead and as a mythology to continue justifying this war on terror and maintaining this idea of this vast Al-Qaeda network headed by bin Laden. And so I want to go back to a couple more quotes. One is I brought up in a couple of these I brought up in the last video about Muslim Brotherhood, and they're still relevant about Al-Qaeda. And one is Zbigniew Brzezinski referred to the explosion of violence in the Middle East as the Ark of Crisis. And he said it was a deliberate plan developed by global strategists like Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, Dr. Alexander King, and Bernard Lewis. And I still firmly believe that this is part of that. They wanted to exploit this Ark of Crisis in the Middle East. And I also want to go back to that quote in my last video from Robert Dreyfus in 1980, and he was talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, but this could easily apply to Al-Qaeda as well. The Anglo-Americans are not merely buying into a terrorists for hire racket. They are partners in a powerful worldwide financial empire that extends from Saudi bank accounts to offshore havens and gun runners and drug dealers. And then last but not least, a quote from Adam Curtis, a very interesting activist filmmaker. I recommend any of his documentaries. I have a playlist of them on my channel I recommend. But he said, quote, "The reality is bin Laden has become the focus of a loose association of disillusioned Islamist militants who were attracted by a new strategy. But there was no organization. There were militants who planned their own operations. Bin Laden was not their commander. There's no evidence bin Laden ever used the term until after 9/11 when he realized the Americans used that term." And then Robin Cook, British Foreign Secretary, went on to say, "The word Al-Qaeda should be translated as the database and refer to the computer file of the thousands of jihadists recruited and trained by the CIA." So there's kind of an interesting dilemma as well. We have one insider, a Saudi who was at the bin Laden camp, who says that the name Al-Qaeda comes from a list that they kept of people who came and went to this training camp, so-called training terrorist camp. And yet we have the British Foreign Secretary saying that it was a database and referred to the computer file of the thousands of jihadists recruited, trained by the CIA. So how interesting is that? The CIA kept a list, a computer file, thousands of jihadists that were recruited and trained and sent into battle, at the same time that bin Laden was keeping a list of jihadists who were trained and recruited and sent into battle, and they both called their list Al-Qaeda. So another little tidbit that kind of shows that perhaps the Al-Qaeda are merely Western puppets. And last but not least, I think the thing that's most important to point out, like I did in the video about Muslim Brotherhood, is the leadership of the so-called Al-Qaeda. And that doesn't necessarily mean local leadership like Zawahiri or bin Laden necessarily either. It could be people who are getting their orders from Saudi Arabia or Islamic centers in the UK. But anyway, it's only necessary for the leaders of these groups to be on board, and they're the ones that can be manipulated. They're the ones that can be bought. They're the ones that are making money off of this, while the throngs, the ones in the streets, the ones burning effigies and flags and attacking Americans and suicide bombings, they can firmly believe in everything that they're doing and still be pawns in this big political game played by the likes of Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Iran, and everyone else involved. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.